Regardez cette paysanne, elle ne sait même pas tenir une fourchette.
Pourtant, je parle mieux votre langue, and my etiquette is superior to your manners.
Schweigen Sie jetzt.
In 1888, high society possessed a weapon sharper than any blade, the whispered insult. When London's most arrogant lord mocked an unassuming woman in flawless French, he expected easy laughter. Instead, he ignited a scandal that would silence a ballroom, shatter reputations, and rewrite the rules of an empire. The London season of 1888 was a ruthless theater, and the ballroom of the Duke of Richmond's grand estate was its most unforgiving stage. Beneath the glow of 3,000 wax candles housed in massive crystal chandeliers, the elite of the British Empire gathered to trade gossip, forge alliances, and destroy reputations. The air was thick with the scent of crushed gardenias, expensive cigar smoke wafting from the terraces, and the suffocating pressure of aristocratic expectation. Standing half-hidden behind a sprawling marble pillar, wrapped in a muted 5-year-old indigo silk gown, stood Miss Josephine Ashford. At 23, Josephine was considered practically a spinster by the vicious standards of Mayfair. But her age was only a secondary crime. Her primary offense was her profound lack of wealth. She was the orphan daughter of Richard Ashford, a brilliant but chronically indebted diplomat who had spent his life dragging his only child across the sprawling map of Europe and Asia. When he succumbed to a sudden fever in Constantinople the previous winter, Josephine was sent back to London, thrust into the begrudging charity of her aunt, Lady Clementine Bassett. Lady Clementine had made her instructions explicitly clear before they stepped out of their carriage. "Keep your eyes lowered, Josephine. Speak only when addressed, and for heaven's sake, try to look pleasantly vacant. Men of consequence do not want a woman who looks as though she is calculating the square root of a piano." And so, Josephine watched. She possessed a mind, like a steel trap, forged in the drawing rooms of St. Petersburg and the sun-drenched verandas of Rome. She had debated trade tariffs with Ottoman officials when she was 17 and transcribed encrypted diplomatic missives for her father. Yet here, among the glittering jewels and stiff tailcoats of her own countrymen, she was nothing but a shadowy piece of furniture. From her vantage point she observed the true power in the room, Lord Tristan Beaumont, the Duke of Westmore. Tristan was 28, possessing a fortune that rivaled the royal families, and a face that looked as though it had been carved from cold marble by a profoundly gifted, somewhat cruel sculptor. He was tall, impeccably tailored in severe black evening wear, and possessed a pair of piercing, storm-gray eyes that viewed the world with unrelenting cynicism. He was a favorite of the Queen, a hero of a minor skirmish in the colonies, and the most dangerous man in London to cross. He was also entirely, agonizingly bored. Tristan leaned against a velvet-draped balcony door, swirling a glass of amber liquid. He was flanked by his usual court of sycophants. Mr. Edwin Caldwell, a man whose spine seemed entirely composed of jelly whenever he was in the presence of a higher title, and Miss Rosalind Fairfax, the undisputed diamond of the season. Rosalind was a vision in spun gold and imported lace, radiating an aggressive beauty that demanded absolute submission from every man she encountered. "The orchestra is dreadfully sluggish tonight," Rosalind complained, snapping her ivory fan shut, "and the company is even worse. Have you noticed, Your Grace, how they are letting absolutely anyone into these events lately?" Tristan's gaze swept over the dance floor, landing with chilling precision on the darkened alcove where Josephine stood. She froze, feeling the sudden weight of his attention. She knew how she must look to him, a dull, tragic little provincial girl, desperately hoping to go unnoticed while nursing a half-empty cup of tepid punch. "Indeed, Miss Fairfax," Tristan murmured, his voice a low, dark velvet baritone that carried over the strains of the violins. "The standards of exclusivity have suffered a tragic collapse. We are practically drowning in mediocrity." Josephine did not look away. For a fleeting second, her dark, intelligent eyes locked with the Duke's storm-gray gaze. She saw the absolute arrogance there, the unshakable belief that he was a god moving among mortals. And Tristan saw nothing. He looked right through her, dismissing her existence in a fraction of a heartbeat. He turned his back to her, leaning closer to Rosalind and Edwin. The gesture was a deliberate erasure. Josephine felt a familiar, cold knot of anger tighten in her chest. She had endured the dismissals of Russian Grand Dukes and French counts, but there was something uniquely suffocating about the snobbery of her own people. She took a slow breath, smoothing the worn fabric of her indigo skirt, reminding herself of her father's final lesson. Never let a lesser mind dictate your worth. She prepared to slip out through the terrace doors, to escape the suffocating heat and the relentless judgment of the elite. But Lord Tristan Beaumont was not finished playing his games, and the night was about to take a turn that London society would whisper about for decades. The supper intermission was announced with the grand striking of a silver gong. The orchestra transitioned from a sweeping waltz to a soft, lingering minuet, and the noise level in the ballroom dropped as the crowd began to filter toward the lavish dining hall. Josephine remained by her pillar, having no desire to endure the humiliating spectacle of finding a dining partner. She planned to wait until the room emptied, snatch a lone pastry from a passing tray, and retreat to the library. Unfortunately, the crush of the crowd forced Tristan, Rosalind, and Edwin directly into her path. They paused mere feet from where Josephine stood, momentarily blocked by the Dowager Duchess of Somerset's enormous feathered train. Rosalind, ever eager to secure Tristan's undivided attention, followed his gaze as it briefly flicked over Josephine again. A cruel, feline smile curved Rosalind's perfectly painted lips. "Good heavens!" Rosalind whispered loudly, entirely unbothered if she was overheard. "Look at the Ashford charity case. Lady Clementine must have draped her in an old set of parlor curtains. It is almost tragic, isn't it? Like a little brown mouse that has accidentally wandered into a sanctuary for swans." Edwin Caldwell chuckled, a high-pitched, reedy sound. "I hear she spent her youth dragging behind her father in the foreign wilderness. Probably hasn't the faintest idea how to hold a teacup properly." Tristan looked at Josephine. She kept her face entirely blank, staring straight ahead at a tapestry on the far wall. She was acutely aware of their proximity. She could smell the crisp scent of bergamot from Tristan's cologne. Bored, and seeking a momentary amusement to break the tedium of the evening, Tristan decided to elevate the mockery. He knew the typical education of an impoverished English lady, a bit of needlework, perhaps the ability to hammer out a clumsy tune on a pianoforte, and English. Only English. To speak foreign languages fluently was a man's pursuit, a diplomatic tool, not something a lowly spinster niece would possess. Tristan leaned in slightly, a wicked, mocking smirk playing at the corners of his mouth. He did not whisper. He pitched his voice to be heard perfectly by his companions and by the girl standing 3 feet away. He spoke in French, not the clumsy, hesitant French taught by governesses, but the rapid, sophisticated, fiercely aristocratic French of the Parisian elite. "Regarde cette créature pitoyable," Tristan began, his tone dripping with an elegant, polished poison. "Look at this pitiful creature. Elle se tient là comme une statue de la misère. Je parie ma fortune qu'elle n'a pas une seule pensée originale dans cette tête vide. She stands there like a statue of misery. I would wager my fortune she hasn't a single original thought in that empty head." Rosalind, whose grasp of French was entirely limited to fashion terms, recognized the mocking cadence and let out a delighted musical laugh. "Oh, your Grace, you are terrible," she purred, pretending to understand the nuance of the insult. Edwin eagerly nodded along, desperate to be part of the joke. Oui, Edwin stammered, looking remarkably foolish. Tristan continued, his storm-gray eyes locked onto the side of Josephine's face, testing her. He wanted to see if she would flush, if she would cry, if she possessed even the instinct of a wounded animal. "C'est une insulte au bon goût qu'elle soit autorisée à respirer le même air que nous," Tristan drawled lazily, taking a sip from his glass. "It is an insult to good taste that she is allowed to breathe the same air as yous. Une paysanne déguisée en soie bon marché. Elle a probablement l'intellect d'un navet." A peasant disguised in cheap silk. She likely has the intellect of a turnip. The sheer cruelty of the words, delivered with such casual, effortless grace, hung in the air. A few bystanders who actually understood the language, a visiting Belgian count and a senior member of Parliament, turned their heads, their expressions a mix of shock and quiet amusement. They waited for the inevitable crush of the poor girl's spirit. The Duke of Westmore had spoken. The verdict was cast. Josephine stood perfectly still. Inside her chest, a tempest was brewing. It wasn't the sorrow of a bullied girl. It was the icy, calculated rage of a woman who had negotiated the release of British prisoners with corrupt military generals in the dead of winter. She had been shot at in the Balkans. She had translated treaties that prevented wars. And now, an overgrown, entitled boy in a silk cravat was comparing her to a root vegetable. She felt the eyes of the Belgian count on her. She felt Rosalind's triumphant sneer. And she felt the Duke's crushing, arrogant expectation that she would simply lower her head and scurry away into the dark. Instead, Josephine reached up, slowly and deliberately, and adjusted the small pearl hairpin in her dark hair. The music from the dining hall seemed to fade into a dull hum. The ambient chatter of the ballroom became white noise. The space between the grand marble pillar and the Duke of Westmore suddenly felt like the center of a Roman Colosseum. Josephine slowly turned her head. She did not look at the floor. She did not look at Rosalind or the sniveling Edwin. She locked her gaze directly onto the storm-gray eyes of Lord Tristan Beaumont, and she smiled. It was not a sweet, forgiving smile. It was a smile made of shattered glass. It was the smile of a predator that had just realized the trap was fully sprung. The silence that fell over their immediate circle was palpable. Tristan, for the first time that evening, felt a microscopic fracture in his absolute confidence. The girl's eyes were not watering, they were burning. They were dark, bottomless, and alight with a terrifying ancient intelligence. Josephine took one step forward. The movement was so fluid, so predatory, that Edwin Caldwell instinctively took a step back. She did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. In a room accustomed to shouting for attention, a perfectly controlled, lethal whisper could cut through steel. Votre accent parisien est passable, votre grâce, Josephine said. The French rolled off her tongue not with the affected, stiff cadence of a nobleman showing off, but with the breathless, liquid perfection of a native. It was the French of the highest diplomatic circles, elegant, razor-sharp, and utterly flawless. Tristan's glass paused halfway to his mouth. The mocking smirk on his lips vanished instantly, replaced by a look of profound, unadulterated shock. Cependant, she continued, stepping closer, her eyes boring into his, votre grammaire est tragiquement imparfaite. Si vous souhaitez insulter une dame de manière publique, je vous suggère d'utiliser le subjonctif avec un peu plus de précision. Sinon, vous ne ressemblez pas à un duc, mais à un palefrenier ivre essayant de réciter de la poésie. Your Parisian accent is passable, Your Grace. However, your grammar is tragically flawed. If you wish to insult a lady publicly, I suggest you use the subjunctive with a bit more precision. Otherwise, you do not sound like a duke, but rather a drunken stable boy attempting to recite poetry. A soft gasp rippled through the immediate bystanders. The Belgian count choked on his champagne. Rosalind, realizing that she had just laughed at something that was now being violently turned against her, looked around in panicked confusion. Tristan was paralyzed. He opened his mouth to speak, to assert his dominance, but his mind, usually so terrifyingly quick, was completely blank. He was staring at a parlor curtain that had just turned into a viper. But Josephine was not finished. She had spent 5 years being invisible. She was going to make sure they remembered this moment until the day they died. She turned her sharp gaze to Edwin and Rosalind. "I voi du poveri siochi," she spat, the language shifting instantaneously. The melodic rapid-fire syllables of Italian spilled from her lips, dripping with aristocratic disdain. "Ridete di insulti che non capite nemmeno, solo per leccare gli stivali di un uomo che vi disprezza. Siete come cani che abbaiano a comando. Machiavelli scrisse che non c'è niente di più patetico di un cortigiano senza mente. Siete la prova vivente della sua teoria. And you two, poor fools, you laugh at insults you cannot even comprehend, solely to lick the boots of a man who despises you. You are like dogs barking on command." Machiavelli wrote that there is nothing more pathetic than a mindless courtier. You are living proof of his theory. Edwin turned the color of old chalk. Rosalind's jaw dropped, her face flushing violently beneath her imported powder. Even without understanding the exact Italian vocabulary, The musical aggression in Josephine's tone made the intent devastatingly clear. She was calling them lapdogs. She was stripping away their dignity layer by layer. The silence had now spread outward. The minuet had ended, and the musicians were resting. The sudden lack of music meant that Josephine's voice, crisp and clear, carried halfway across the Duke of Richmond's ballroom. Dozens of aristocrats were now turning, staring at the unassuming girl in the indigo dress who was currently holding the most powerful duke in England verbally hostage. Josephine turned back to Tristan. The Duke of Westmore was no longer looking at her with boredom. His chest was rising and falling rapidly. His gray eyes were wide, utterly mesmerized, locked onto her face as if she had just fallen from the sky in a shower of meteors. She stepped intimately close to him, so close she could see the faint pulse beating wildly at the base of his throat. When she spoke her final volley, she did not use a Romance language. She summoned the harsh, commanding, brutally powerful syllables of Russian. It was a language practically unheard of in London drawing rooms, a language of snow and iron and immense power. True power, your grace, does not require the humiliation of the weak. She commanded, her voice ringing out like a judge delivering a death sentence. You wear a crown of gold, but your mind is that of a coward. You are worth nothing. The Russian words struck the ballroom like a physical blow. The guttural, forceful consonants were so foreign, so deeply intimidating, that a few dowagers physically clutched their pearls. Tristan stood frozen. He didn't know Russian. He didn't know what she had just said to him. But the sheer, overwhelming dominance of her delivery made his blood run cold, and then, inexplicably, hot. Josephine held his gaze for 3 agonizingly long seconds, ensuring he felt the absolute, crushing weight of his own insignificance. Then, she softened her expression, returning to the mask of the polite, provincial English wallflower. Next time you wish to insult me, your grace, Josephine said in perfect, unaccented English, her voice ringing crystal clear into the dead silence of the room, do try Mandarin. It is the only language in which I might actually require a dictionary. She gave him a flawless, perfectly executed curtsy, a mockery of the utmost respect. Without waiting for a response from the petrified Duke, the trembling Edwin, or the mortified Rosalind, Miss Josephine Ashford turned on her heel. The crowd instinctively parted for her, stepping back as if she were royalty. She walked straight through the sea of stunned aristocrats, her head held high, the faded indigo silk of her dress swishing softly against the marble floor, and disappeared through the terrace doors into the London night. Behind her, Lord Tristan Beaumont remained rooted to the spot. The glass in his hand trembled slightly. The boredom that had plagued his existence for 28 years was gone, incinerated in a span of 2 minutes by a penniless girl who had just brought him to his knees without throwing a single punch. He didn't feel anger. God help him. He felt completely, dangerously obsessed. By dawn, the scandalous events at the Duke of Richmond's estate had already saturated the bloodline of London's elite. The whispers flowed through the morning parlors of Mayfair faster than spilled ink across a blotter. It was a societal earthquake. A penniless spinster, practically a charity case, had not only defied the Duke of Westmore but had verbally eviscerated him in 3 distinct languages before turning her back on him. The sheer audacity of her departure was the singular topic over buttered crumpets and Earl Grey tea. In the modest, slightly damp townhouse of Lady Clementine Bassett, on the less fashionable fringes of Kensington, the atmosphere was entirely devoid of triumph. It was, instead, steeped in apocalyptic panic. Lady Clementine was currently pacing the length of her faded floral drawing-room carpet, clutching a lace handkerchief to her chest as if trying to physically hold her heart inside her ribcage. Josephine Ashford sat calmly by the window, her hands folded in her lap, watching the morning fog roll thickly over the cobblestones. She was already dressed in a sensible traveling gown of dark wool. Her trunk, battered from years of crossing the continent, was packed and waiting in the hallway. She harbored no illusions about her fate. In the ruthless arithmetic of high society, one did not humiliate a duke and remain in London. She fully expected her aunt to banish her to a remote cottage in Yorkshire before noon. "You have destroyed us," Lady Clementine gasped, dropping onto a worn velvet settee. "You have completely, irrevocably destroyed us," Josephine. I told you to look vacant. I told you to be silent. And what do? You unleash a demonic linguistic tirade upon the most vindictive, powerful man in the entire country. We shall be ruined. The butchers will not even sell us meat by tomorrow. Josephine did not apologize. She turned her dark, intelligent eyes toward her frantic aunt. He insulted me, Aunt Clementine. He insulted my intelligence, my upbringing, and by extension, my father. I will not accept humiliation from a man simply because his ancestors happened to steal more land than mine did. Lady Clementine let out a sound that was half sob, half shriek, but before she could launch into another desperate lecture, the heavy brass knocker on their front door sounded with a demanding, rhythmic strike. It was not the polite tap of a morning caller. It was the heavy, authoritative pounding of a conqueror. A moment later, their elderly maid appeared in the doorway, her eyes wide as saucers, her hands trembling violently. She did not even announce the guest. She simply stepped aside. Lord Tristan Beaumont, the Duke of Westmore, filled the doorway. He was not dressed in the severe black evening wear of the night before, but in a sharply tailored charcoal morning coat, gripping a silver-handled walking stick. He looked dangerously awake, his storm-gray eyes entirely devoid of their usual paralyzing boredom. He stepped into the cramped parlor, making the room feel instantly microscopic. Lady Clementine leaped to her feet, nearly tripping over her own hem, and sank into a curtsy so deep she practically vanished into the floorboards. "Your Grace," she stammered, her voice trembling. "I beg of you, forgive the insolence of my niece. She was raised in the wilderness. She knows not the manners of civilized society." "Leave us," Tristan commanded. His voice was low, smooth, and absolute. It was not a request. Lady Clementine opened her mouth to protest the profound impropriety of leaving an unmarried girl alone with a man, but one glance at the Duke's face silenced her instantly. She scurried from the room, pulling the door shut behind her with a soft click. Silence descended upon the parlor. Josephine remained seated by the window. She did not stand. She did not curtsy. She simply looked at him, her spine perfectly straight, her expression an impenetrable mask of calm defiance. She braced herself for his wrath, for the threats that would surely ruin what little remained of her life. Tristan walked slowly across the room. He stopped 3 feet from her chair. He studied her face, taking in the fierce intelligence burning behind her dark eyes, the stubborn set of her jaw. He did not look at her with the condescending mockery of the previous night. He looked at her as if she were a complicated, fascinating puzzle that he had unexpectedly discovered in a room full of simple children's toys. "I did not sleep last night, Miss Ashford," Tristan said quietly. "A guilty conscience is a known remedy for insomnia." "Your Grace," Josephine replied evenly, not breaking eye contact, "though I am surprised to learn you possess one." Tristan let out a short, sharp breath that might have been a laugh. He leaned his weight onto his walking stick. "I have come to a profound realization. I have spent the last decade of my life surrounded by people who agree with everything I say before I have even finished saying it. It is an intoxicating, agonizingly dull existence. You were correct. I am arrogant. I am needlessly cruel. And my French grammar in the subjunctive tense was, indeed, tragically flawed." Josephine's eyebrows rose a fraction of an inch. A confession of fault from the Duke of Westmore was roughly equivalent to a snowfall in the Sahara. "Are you here to beg my forgiveness, my lord?" "Because I assure you, I have no interest in your apologies." "I am not here to apologize," Tristan said, his tone suddenly shifting from reflective to sharply professional. "I am here because you are the daughter of Richard Ashford, and you possess a mind that just might prevent a war." He reached into the inner pocket of his coat and withdrew a folded piece of heavy parchment. He tossed it onto the small tea table beside her chair. Josephine glanced down. The parchment was covered in a chaotic array of numerical sequences, interspersed with Cyrillic letters and French abbreviations. It was a highly sophisticated diplomatic cipher. "My father," Tristan began, his voice dropping to a confidential murmur, "was heavily involved in the shadow affairs of the Foreign Office. I inherited his seat, his fortune, and his headaches. Lord Salisbury is currently managing a crisis that cannot be made public. The Russian minister, Nikolai Gears, has been secretly communicating with a faction in Paris to undermine the British naval position in the Mediterranean. We intercepted this letter 3 days ago in Calais. Josephine looked from the cipher to Tristan, her curiosity temporarily overriding her hostility. And your own decoders at Whitehall cannot break it? They are brilliant men, but they are rigid, Tristan explained, stepping closer. They look for mathematical patterns. But this code is not mathematical. It is linguistic. It shifts between 3 languages, Russian, French, and something else entirely. It requires a mind that thinks fluidly across borders. It requires someone who understands the syntax of foreign diplomacy, not just the vocabulary. He paused, his gray eyes locking onto hers with a burning intensity. Last night, you humiliated me with an intellectual precision I have never encountered in my life. You proved that you are entirely fearless and devastatingly clever. I need you to read this letter, Miss Ashford. Josephine looked at the parchment. She recognized the structure immediately. It was a polyalphabetic substitution cipher, but the key was shifting based on linguistic dialects, specifically a dialect of Old Street. Petersburg aristocratic slang mixed with Parisian trade terms. Her father had taught her this exact method when she was 16 in Constantinople. She looked back up at the Duke. And if I refuse? If I decide to let your glorious empire suffer the consequences of its own arrogant ignorance? Tristan leaned down, bringing his face level with hers. The scent of bergamot and cold rain enveloped her. If you refuse, you will likely spend the rest of your days rotting in a damp cottage in Yorkshire, dying of boredom while your brilliant mind goes to waste. If you agree to help me, I will ensure that Lady Clementine's social standing is not only restored but elevated beyond her wildest dreams. You will have access to the finest libraries in Europe, and you will never be treated as a shadow in a ballroom ever again. Josephine stared into his eyes. She saw the challenge there, the desperate, thrilling demand for a partner of equal intellect. She looked at the encrypted letter. It was the scent of the hunt, the call of the great game her father had loved so much. Slowly, deliberately, Josephine reached out and picked up the parchment. You will need to fetch me a pot of very strong black tea. Your Grace, Josephine said, her voice cool and authoritative, and a fresh bottle of ink. If we are to prevent a war, I refuse to do it while parched. A slow, devastatingly handsome smile broke across Tristan's face. It was the first genuine smile she had ever seen from him. At once, Miss Ashford. For the next 3 weeks, the elite of London whispered about the scandalous, inexplicable partnership between the untouchable Duke of Westmore and the impoverished Miss Ashford. To the absolute horror of Rosalind Fairfax and the trembling confusion of Edwin Caldwell, Tristan openly courted Josephine's company. He did not take her to the park for mindless carriage rides. He brought her to his sprawling private estate, escorting her into his heavily guarded library. They worked late into the night beneath the warm glow of gas lamps, the massive oak table spread with maps of the Bosphorus, translation dictionaries, and encrypted dispatches. The hostility that had sparked their initial encounter slowly transformed into a crackling, electric, mutual respect. Tristan was mesmerized by her. He watched as she paced the length of his library, muttering to herself in rapid Italian, her brow furrowed in fierce concentration. She challenged his political theories, fiercely debated military strategy, and possessed a razor-sharp wit that constantly kept him off balance. For Josephine, the arrogant monster of the ballroom was dissolving, revealing a man who was deeply passionate about his country, fiercely intelligent, and surprisingly vulnerable when he dropped his mask of aristocratic boredom. It was on a rain-swept Tuesday at midnight that the cipher finally broke. Josephine was seated at the massive mahogany desk, her fingers stained with ink. She had finally cracked the shifting linguistic key. She was rapidly translating the Russian phrases into English, her pen flying across the paper. Tristan was standing directly behind her chair, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. Suddenly, Josephine's hand froze. The pen hovered over the parchment, trembling violently. A single drop of black ink fell, splattering against the wood. "What is it?" Tristan asked instantly, his voice tight with concern. He placed a steadying hand on her shoulder. Josephine stared at the words she had just written. The color had completely drained from her face. leaving her looking like a marble statue. This letter, it is not just detailing Russian naval movements. Her voice was a broken whisper. It is a ledger, a list of payments. Tristan leaned closer, reading the newly translated English text over her shoulder. The letter detailed massive sums of gold transferred from Russian accounts into the private holdings of an unnamed British official. The official was providing London's naval patrol schedules in the Mediterranean, effectively allowing Russian warships to move undetected. But it was the final paragraph that made Josephine's blood turn to ice. The matter in Constantinople has been resolved. Richard Ashford became too curious regarding the Mediterranean shipping schedules. As per your instructions, the fever was introduced into his evening wine. He suspected nothing. We await your final payment for his silence. A suffocating silence filled the library. The rain lashed furiously against the tall glass windows. Josephine could not breathe. Her father had not died of a random, tragic fever. He had been murdered, assassinated in the dark to protect a traitor within his own government. The grief she had carefully buried over the past year erupted with violent force, tearing through her chest. She let out a choked, shattered breath and buried her face in her hands. Instantly, Tristan was kneeling beside her chair. The cold, unfeeling Duke vanished entirely. He gently grasped her wrists, pulling her hands away from her face, his storm-gray eyes filled with a fierce, burning fury that matched her own broken heart. "Josephine," he said, using her Christian name for the first time. His voice was a vow, hard as steel. "Look at me." She met his gaze through a blur of unshed tears. "We will find the man who orchestrated this," Tristan promised, his grip on her hands tightening, grounding her in the storm. "I do not care if he is a lord, a minister, or the king himself. I will tear London apart brick by brick, and I will hand you his ruin. Do you understand me?" Josephine swallowed hard, the tears spilling over her lashes. She looked into his eyes and saw the absolute truth of his words. He was no longer playing a political game. He was fighting for her. She nodded slowly, her sorrow hardening into a razor-sharp desire for vengeance. Yes, the clue lay in the cipher itself. The specific dialect of Parisian slang used to disguise the payment dates was unique. It was a dialect favored by the gambling dens of Montmartre. There was only one man in the British Foreign Office who spent his youth accumulating massive gambling debts in Paris before miraculously paying them off to enter politics. Simon Rutledge, the senior Under-Secretary of State. 3 nights later, the climax of the London season arrived. The Prime Minister's Grand Autumn Gala at the Foreign Office. The glittering halls were packed with ambassadors, royalty, and the absolute pinnacle of British society. The chandeliers blazed, the orchestra played a sweeping waltz, and the champagne flowed like water. Simon Rutledge, a rotund man with a nervous sweat constantly glistening on his brow, was holding court near the grand staircase, boasting loudly about British naval supremacy to a group of bored diplomats. The great oak doors to the ballroom swung open. The music faltered slightly as the crowd turned. Lord Tristan Beaumont stepped into the room. He looked like an avenging angel, dressed in immaculate formal wear, his expression carved from dark ice. But it was the woman on his arm that caused a collective gasp to echo through the hall. Josephine Ashford was no longer wearing faded indigo silk. She was draped in a breathtaking gown of midnight blue velvet, diamonds glittering at her throat. Her dark hair swept up in an intricate, regal style. She looked like a foreign queen, walking with a lethal, terrifying grace. Rosalind Fairfax, standing near the punch bowl, actually dropped her glass. It shattered onto the marble floor. Tristan and Josephine did not stop to greet anyone. They walked in perfect synchronization, slicing through the crowd directly towards Simon Rutledge. The Undersecretary's boastful smile faltered as the Duke approached. "Your Grace," Rutledge stammered, dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "A pleasure to see you. And, Miss Ashford, is it not?" Tristan stopped a foot away from Rutledge. The surrounding aristocrats fell dead silent, sensing the sudden, dangerous shift in the atmosphere. Tristan reached into his breast pocket and slowly withdrew a perfectly translated, finalized copy of the intercepted letter. He did not raise his voice, but in the sudden quiet of the room, his words carried like gunshot. He did not speak in English. Tristan looked directly into Rutledge's terrified eyes, and with flawless, razor-sharp pronunciation, he spoke in the Montmartre dialect of French. Votre dette de jeu à Paris a été payée avec le sang d'un homme bon. Rutledge, Tristan commanded, his voice dripping with lethal authority. Your gambling debt in Paris was paid with the blood of a good man, Rutledge. Et Lord du Tsar ne vous sauvera pas de la corde du bourreau, and the Tsar's gold will not save you from the hangman's rope. Rutledge turned the color of ash. He stared at the translated letter in Tristan's hand, recognizing the exact dates and sums of his treason. He took a stumbling step backward, his breath coming in short, panicked gasps. He looked around the room, but the elite crowd, recognizing the tone of absolute condemnation, instinctively stepped away from him. Guards. Tristan barked in English, his voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Arrest the Undersecretary for high treason against the Crown and for the murder of Ambassador Richard Ashford. Chaos erupted. Royal guards seized the weeping, collapsing Rutledge, dragging him from the ballroom amid the shocked screams of the nobility. The Prime Minister himself hurried forward, demanding to see the evidence. Tristan handed him the translation, effectively sealing Rutledge's fate and clearing Richard Ashford's name forever. In the center of the swirling madness, Tristan turned his back on the crowd. He looked only at Josephine. Her father was avenged. The shadow that had haunted her had been destroyed. She looked up at the man who had helped her achieve it, the man she had once despised, the man she now realized she loved with an all-consuming fire. Tristan stepped into her space, ignoring the hundreds of staring eyes. He reached out, his gloved hand gently cupping her jaw, his thumb brushing against her cheek. Then, the Duke of Westmore, the most arrogant man in London, slowly dropped to one knee on the marble floor. A collective stunned silence once again paralyzed the ballroom. Lady Clementine, watching from the sidelines, fainted entirely. Tristan looked up into Josephine's dark, brilliant eyes. He knew English was too mundane, French too heavily tied to their bitter beginning, and Italian too theatrical. He wanted a language of power, of unbreakable vows. My equal, Tristan spoke, his voice vibrating with absolute devotion, utilizing the Russian she had commanded him with weeks prior. My heart belongs to your mind. Marry me. Josephine stared down at him, tears of fierce joy burning in her eyes. She smiled, a radiant, triumphant smile that outshone every chandelier in the palace. She reached down, took his hands in hers, and answered in the only language that mattered in that moment. Yes, she whispered in perfect English. Do you love stories where sharp intellect triumphs over arrogant high society? If Josephine's brilliant three-language takedown and Tristan's unexpected redemption kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button right now. Share this thrilling historical romance drama with your friends who crave fierce heroines and enemies to lovers twists. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and ring the bell so you never miss another epic real-life tale of love, revenge, and ultimate triumph.